Welcome back, guys. Industry comes of age. We're now talking about after the Civil War and things begin to change. I'm your professor for today, Dr. Chris Erskine, and I want to start talking today about railroads and transportation. We're going to look at several maps and lots of pictures today in both one lesson, the first lesson, and the second lesson. So in this map, we can see, if you look at this map on the first slide, have a look at that, and you'll see that this is a map from 1860. And the red lines are the map, are the railroads. Look at the next slide, 1870. What do you see different? Wow, well, we've got, for one, we've got a railroad all the way across the United States. And we can also see that the western boundary of the United States is changing. It's moving further and further west. Now look to the next slide, 1880. Wow, now there's not just one railroad across the country, but there's a couple. And the railroad lines continue to push further and further to the west. And then look at the next one. Holy cow, now railroads are everywhere. This looks kind of like what we might see if we were looking at a cell phone coverage map here in the United States. And this is where all the places where they have cell phone coverage. Railroads are everywhere. But then look at the next slide. These are auto routes. So this is the United States. If you're looking at this map, this is the United States and where all the roads are in 1907. And 1907 is just not a terribly important date, except of course we can't say 1900 because no one was really traveling by car then. The first across the country car trip was in 1903 by a doctor from Vermont. His name was Horatio Jackson. And you don't need to know that, it's just fun information. But here we see roads going across the United States and not so many. Today, the road map looks more like the railroad map does that we looked at in the last slide. So this is great. Looking at the next slide, this question is, growth is great, but at what expense? What is the suffering? What is, we always have good things, but there's always a cost. If I want to go and buy something to drink at the 7-Eleven, well, I can go and buy it, and I have something nice and cold to drink, but now I have less money in my wallet. So what is the cost of all of these roads? What do you think they might be? I want you to pause the video for just a minute, and I want you to think about and write some things down and talk with your neighbor, the person next to you. And I want you to ask yourself and to talk about this expansion, looking at these maps. And you can look at these maps. If you want to go back a little bit and see these maps, look at these maps, and I want you to ask yourself, what is the expense? What is the cost for all of this growth? So when you're done talking about this with your neighbors, your friends, thinking about this, come back. See you in a bit. Okay, so what is it? Well, look at the next slide. I hope you said some of these things. They're pushing Native Americans off of the land further and further west. These people that have been here for long before Europeans arrived, we're just pushing them more and more to the west. Labor abuse. Women and children have to work very hard, and it's dangerous at work. And so there's no laws, or not many laws, that kind of regulate how many hours someone can work or whether the place that they work must be safe. And today we have those in place, but 120, 30 years ago we did not. The growth of monopolies. Now, what is a monopoly? That might be a new word for you. A monopoly, when most kids in the United States think of a monopoly, they think of a board game. But a monopoly is where one person or one company owns all of the industry. So for example, phone companies. If we had only one phone company, maybe it's AT&T, or maybe it's Sprint, or maybe T-Mobile, or maybe Verizon. But we have those big four. But if we only had one, and that one company controlled all of the phones in the United States, that's a monopoly. And in the United States, monopolies are against the law. Now, they weren't so much during this period, but they become against the law. So there's this growth of monopolies, which means that if you control the one industry, if you control all cell phones, then you can charge any rate, you can charge very high prices if you want. And so that's why monopolies are not legal in the United States. And sometimes the government has to come in and break them apart and split them into smaller companies. So is this right or wrong, the pushing of the Native Americans to the West? Well, that's a question that in this country, almost immediately everyone says, oh, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing to have pushed the Native Americans west. But I want you to think about this. It's war, and I'm not saying it wasn't wrong, but I want us to think about it. Do the Americans have the right to push Native Americans into reservations? Do we have the right to push them west? Well, do they have the right to resist signing the treaties? Giving up their land? Sure they do. What happens in war? One country pushes the other country away. Now, I don't want to suggest that pushing Native Americans into reservations was good or okay. That's not what I want to say. What I do want to say is that sometimes we think about these problems from how we think today, not how our great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers thought about them in their day. And so maybe the way that they understood things was a little bit differently, and maybe it wasn't. But that's something that we should talk, you should think more about. Look at the slide that says the RR. Now in English, when we say RR, we mean railroad. Now this picture that we have here is a picture of the very first station that was built in the New York subway in 1904, and it's called City Hall. And today it's closed. It's still there, but it's closed. And the New York subway is the oldest subway, the oldest underground railroad in the United States, in the world, actually. And so in 1840, we have not underground, but railroad tracks. We have 2,800 miles of tracks. 1850, we have 9,000. 1860, 30,000. 1870, 53,000. 1880, 93,000. 1890, 163,000. The Boston subway is not open anymore. They're starting to open another one, but it wasn't. 1900, we have 193,000 miles. And the New York subway opens in 1904. By 1916, we have 254,000 miles of railroad in the United States. And we don't have more than that today. That's the high point. We began to move towards roads rather than railroads. So there's this massive growth of the ability of Americans to travel from here to there. And that's a good thing. Looking at the next slide, so this influences not just your ability to travel, because today, if you want to go from, say, Beijing to Guangzhou, then you just hop on a train and you can be there in several hours. Or from, say, Shanghai to Wuhan, you can be there in just several hours. Even take the Gaotie, the high-speed rail, and you can be there in no time. So the railroad is a good thing for passenger travel. However, it also helped other areas, because today we see big trucks that carry things in the United States and in China. You see big trucks and they haul all kinds of toys or food or cars. Well, that was all on the railroad in the United States in the late 1800s. And so now you can have food that you could not have before, because you can grow oranges in Southern California, but not in New York. You can grow bananas in South America, but not in the United States, or not in the northern part of the United States. And so you can move that food from one place to the other place very easily. So you might be able to grow onions and soybeans in one part of the country, and grapes that you cannot grow, and those are in the kind of the northern cooler climates, but you cannot grow those in the southern climates as well. And so that food crosses, and so your diet changes. And your ability to travel changes. So many things change. Technology also improved. The windmill, better plows, better farming technology, barbed wire, which means that you can set your field, and other farmers' cows cannot come into your field. And so the farmer and so many people became dependent on the railroad and transportation. Cattle ranchers also drove to railheads, and they would have hundreds of cattle, and they would take them all to a rail station, but they were called a railhead, and it was the end of the line sometimes, and they would come to the end of that line with their cattle, and it would take them days to kind of herd all their cattle across the frontier to that railhead. They would then load them onto the rail car, and sometimes they would be slaughtered for meat right there, and sometimes they get on the rail car and travel to Chicago or St. Louis or some Buffalo, and they might be slaughtered in these other cities as they got closer to the eastern part of the United States. And so this was a major innovation and major change in the United States after the Civil War, from about 1860 to about 1900, 1910. So about 50 years of time that really changed. Everything changed in the United States because of the railroad. And that's a really important aspect of American history, the railroad. And we'll talk more about that and why that was possible in another lesson. So talk to you guys next lesson, part 2. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.